Hi, I'm Joanna, and I've already changed 3 schools. The thing is, I was an excellent student, and the teachers constantly set me as the example. But in the end, my friends couldn't stand it any longer and started spreading dirty rumors about me. I decided I didn't want to study with jerks. So I asked my mom to transfer me to a new school, and that happened several times. When I first came to the new class in my current school, I was expecting everyone to throw snotty little side glances at me again, of course. But my new classmates turned out to be pretty friendly. A girl came up to me right away. Hi, I'm Susie. Come on, I'll show you around. Well, Susie turned out to be a terrible gossip. An hour after we'd met, I already knew almost everything there was to know about my new classmates. But it was still nice to make friends with someone. The first class was my favorite, math. The teacher came in, sternly looked at the students, and stopped at me. Stand up, miss. I got up and I started the floor in embarrassment. You should have seen what started then. Mrs. Smith began to scold me in front of everyone for my bright hair, piercing, and short skirt. I wanted to sink through the floor. My face was burning for the rest of the class, and I even missed the explanation of a new topic. After the bell rang, I asked Susie, why did she rip into me like that?
Oh, don't mind Miss Smith. She can be pretty weird sometimes. Tomorrow, she'll forget all about it. Don't worry. Just wear whatever you want.
That calmed me down a little bit. The next morning, I came to school looking just the same, and Susie had been right. Mrs. Smith didn't say a word about my looks, but she did ask me to come to the blackboard. I looked at the task and was delighted because I'd solved hundreds of similar ones in my previous school. But then, the teacher said, solve it, but only use the method that I showed you during the last lesson. Oops. I had been so out of sorts because of Miss Smith's scolding that I hadn't been paying attention to her at all. But luckily, Susie saved me. She started to write the solution in a large notebook and show it to me from her desk at the back of the classroom. I copied everything onto the board, and I gratefully winked at my new friend. When Mrs. Smith suddenly shouted, where did you even get these numbers from? What have they even been teaching you in your other schools? Damn it. I'd probably misunderstood what Susie had written and made a mistake somewhere. The teacher snatched the marker from my hand and started to write on the board with an important look in her eye. Here's the solution I expected from you. I couldn't help myself. But that's so much more complicated. I wiped her notes off the board and wrote my own answer in. I'd learned the methods in my previous schools. My solution was much shorter than Mrs. Smith's, but the answer was still the same. I turned to the class and I explained how I had done that. Even the hooligans broke away from their mobile phones, and they stared at the board. After I finished, one of them said, whoa, turns out everything's pretty simple. Hey, new girl, you're pretty cool. Yeah, Mrs. Smith did not like that at all. She frowned, pressing her lips together nervously, and she sat at her desk. All right, Joanna, since you're so smart, I bet you won't have any problems teaching the next class in my place. But I was glad, because math had always come easy to me. But then Miss Smith told me the topic. You'll be telling us about integrals. I immediately turned pale. I had never covered that topic yet, and the only thing I knew about them was that they were very difficult. But still, I couldn't give up just like that. I had to show that mean teacher up. So that's why I spent the whole day and all night reading my textbooks. And by morning, I thought I'd come up with the perfect lesson plan. But to be honest, I was terribly worried. However, as soon as I walked into the classroom, Susie hugged me.
Hey, cheer up. I know you can do it.
And that gave me confidence. I started explaining integrals, and I got so carried away in the process that I even sat right on the teacher's desk. At that moment, I didn't care what Miss Smith had to say about it, because everything was going perfectly. At the end, my classmates clapped, and only the teacher looked annoyed, because, of course, after all, I had won. I came back home feeling very pleased with myself, and I was going to tell my mom all about my success when, all of a sudden, she called to me sternly. I saw your gradebook online. What were you thinking? I looked at my mom's laptop and I choked on a piece of gum in surprise. In my diary was a D for behavior. Mrs. Smith had written the explanation as sat on the teacher's desk. God, could she be any more insufferable? She just couldn't bear that a schoolgirl could explain complex topics better than her. I told my mom what had really happened and she praised me for my courage. But she still advised me not to argue with Mrs. Smith. She's a teacher. No matter what, everything will be as she says it is. Well, we would see about that. I decided I would take revenge on my teacher for such an injustice. But morning came and I still hadn't come up with anything. At school, Susie distracted me from thinking about Miss Smith.
Hey, look! A school beauty contest got announced. You should participate!
I felt so happy that I even forgot about my devious plans. From that day on, I began to prepare diligently for the contest. I practiced how I would walk. I chose a song. I bought an incredible dress. And Susie helped me with everything and psyched me up for the victory. And long story short, on the day of the contest, I was 100% ready. As soon as my number was announced, I went on stage, and as Susie had advised me to, I threw a confident glance at the jury. But imagine my surprise when in one of the judges' chairs, I saw Mrs. Smith. She was slyly smiling and writing something down in a notebook. I broke into a sweat. Now I definitely wouldn't win, no matter how hard I tried. I tensed up and my body locked. My legs suddenly stopped obeying me, and I walked like a duck, stumbled, and almost sprawled out in the middle of the stage. But that wasn't the worst part. During the creative performance, I couldn't even hit the high notes, and I wheezed in some awful voice. The audience burst out laughing, and a malicious smile spread across Miss Smith's face. As you might have guessed, I lost the contest. Out of pity, the jury members gave me average scores. But Mrs. Smith decided to finish me off and held up a sign with the lowest possible score. 1. Tears welled up in my eyes. I was about to run away from that humiliation when the teacher suddenly picked up the microphone. "Joanna, I expected more from you. Next time, how about you do us a favor? Work on your walk and your voice, and take pity on our eyes and ears." It all became too much for me. She had absolutely no right to humiliate me like that. I grabbed the microphone and I told Miss Smith everything I thought of her. The jury and the audience sat with their mouths wide open, and Susie kept pressing her finger to her lips with a pleading look, but there was no stopping me. After my fiery speech, I finally exhaled. I felt so much better. With a proud look, I finally got down from the stage, and I only burst into tears once I'd gotten out onto the street. After a scandal like this, I would absolutely have to look for a new school again. And after I had finally found some good friends, I was heading home when I suddenly heard Susie's voice.
Wait, Joanna, I need to tell you something.
What is there to talk about?
I've been hiding something from you. When Mrs. Smith came to our school, all of the girls here were like you. We wore tight clothes and makeup and we did our hair. But then we started to notice something odd. The cooler we looked, the worse our grades were. It was suspicious, so we Googled our teacher. It turned out that in her youth, she was a real beauty and even took part in beauty contests. She'd almost won, but the jury suddenly chose another girl as the winner, Fiona Hill. Mrs. Smith was devastated. After her fiance left her for that same Fiona, she got terribly depressed. She stopped caring about herself and started dressing in boring clothes. Apparently, after all that, Mrs. Smith had grown to hate pretty girls and took it out on us. We decided we wouldn't anger her and try to look more modest.
That infuriated me. Why didn't you tell me right away? I wouldn't have tried to stand out then.
We were so happy when you came. After all, Mrs. Smith left us alone and switched to you. I'm sorry. It was a mean thing to do, but I really like being friends with you. I don't want you to transfer to another school.
I forgave Susie because she was brave enough to confess everything. But now, if I didn't want to be thrown out of the school, I somehow had to make up with Mrs. Smith. I spent the whole evening surfing the net and reading about the contest. And in the morning, I finally had an idea. I got to the school early and I waited for Mrs. Smith at her office. She was obviously not happy to see me, but she listened anyway. I'm sorry. I said a lot of things that I shouldn't have yesterday. Students can't talk to teachers like that. It is unacceptable. You really hurt me, but now I know why, and I want to help you. Remember Fiona Hill? She still works as a model. In about a week's time, she's going to be competing in the Miss New York contest. Well, it's a contest for married people. What if you also applied and took away the crown from your longtime rival? Mrs. Smith looked at me like I was insane, but I didn't give up and I kept trying to convince her. In the end, the teacher stopped being angry and turned red. How would I dare get on the catwalk? Look at me. I'm not the girl I was 20 years ago. Nonsense! You are beautiful. Only for some reason, you forgot. Mrs. Smith smiled and agreed to my crazy idea. On that same day, we began preparing for the contest. After school, I took the teacher to my mom's beauty salon and went to choose a cool dress and jewelry for Mrs. Smith with Susie. And when we saw our teacher's new look, we jumped with delight. Our teacher looked incredible. We spent the whole week practicing the right walk. Mrs. Smith learned to walk the runway so confidently, it was like there had never been a 20-year break. Susie and I were pleased with our work, and we invited our classmates to come support the teacher at the contest. And on that very important evening, we all took our seats in the auditorium, while Susie and I stayed backstage with Mrs. Smith. She was in a great mood, but then a woman came up to us. I recognized her immediately. It was Fiona Hill. She started hugging our teacher like they were old friends or something. With a nasty smile on her face, the woman began to talk about her life and show photos from expensive resorts. and it turned out that she was married to the man she had stolen from Mrs. Smith, and now they had 3 children. After such news, our teacher almost completely fell apart.
Girls, we shouldn't have started any of this. I'd rather not participate.
No, you can't give up when victory is almost yours. You've seen Mrs. Hill, right? You look 100 times more beautiful and younger. Oddly enough, my words worked. Our teacher pulled herself together and performed so coolly that I had no doubts she would become the next Ms. New York. Before the announcement of the results, the judges left to confer, and I hurried to the bathroom. I was about to leave the stall when I suddenly heard Fiona Hill's voice. I stood on the toilet seat and I carefully looked out from behind the door. The woman was sobbing into the shoulders of some other older woman. I took out my phone and I turned on the camera. I definitely wasn't expecting to hear anything like this.
Mom, Smith is just so much better than me. It's obvious to everyone this time, and she's gonna win. And this time, you're not gonna be able to do anything about it.
Don't worry, I've thought it all through.
Just like last time I paid the organizer, the crown will be yours again.
I was shocked. That was so low. I wasn't gonna let Mrs. Smith get upset again because of a fake victory from her liar rival. So as soon as the women left, I rushed backstage and I found the presenter. I told them all I had just heard and I sent them the video. And after that, I walked up to Mrs. Smith, smiling mysteriously. I think I have a pleasant surprise for you. My teacher was just about to say something, but then the jury members returned to their seats. The presenter came onto the stage and asked for a few moments of our attention. My video from the toilet started playing on the huge projector, and for a few seconds, the judges froze with their mouths open. You should have seen what started then. The police came and took away everyone who had taken part in the conspiracy. Mrs. Smith burst into tears and hugged me tightly.
Oh, thank you, dear.
To think, for 20 years, I blamed myself for that failure. I was so insecure that I took it out on my students. Turns out, it wasn't my fault after all. But Mrs. Smith was interrupted by the presenter's voice. Despite all that has happened, we must choose a real winner. Dear jury, please tell us her name. My heart was pounding like mad. I squeezed my eyes shut, clenched my fists, and heard Mrs. Smith's name. Yes! She won! Won! That evening, the teacher got her long-awaited crown, but she gave it to me. She said that I deserved such an award, perhaps even more than she did. And since then, our school life changed dramatically. The girls were no longer afraid to wear fashionable clothes or makeup. Mrs. Smith had turned into a smiling beauty and had started to evaluate us for our knowledge instead. Well, almost. To me, as her favorite, she sometimes gave a couple of extra points. But shh, don't tell anyone. A couple of days ago, Mrs. Smith invited Susie and I to a tea party after school. Imagine, the groom who had once left her for Fiona Hill had written to her, but of course, she turned him down. And that's how I got 2 friends at once, a girl the same age as me, and a teacher. Share this video with someone who will definitely need it.
This is the SCP Foundation, a secret organization that finds and studies anomalous objects all over the planet. These are the Foundation's secret files. You may already be familiar with them, and these are the stories of ordinary people who got lucky to encounter the most horrifying creatures in the world. The SCP Chronicles reveal new details about the anomalous objects you didn't know before.